Our next speaker, I'm really delighted that I get to introduce him because I've spent a lot of time with this man over the past few months and I've never really had the chance to see him speak properly, so today is a bit of a prize for me too. So, John Baker is often the quiet person at the back of the room, but today he is at the front of the room and he'll be sharing 30 years' experience coaching teams across Europe to get more from themselves, their introverts and their clients. To help you get more from the introverts in your audience, please welcome the introvert in business, John Baker.
Two and a half hours up the M1 on a grey, foggy, rainy day. Arrive in the car park and you'd have thought I've been exhausted. No. Absolutely fizzing with energy, expectant, looking forward to what follows. Because I've just arrived at a 3-day conference that I've booked in for 6 months ago, and it's going to be brilliant. Perhaps you can take the feeling you had this morning when you arrived here as you were looking expectantly what you're going to learn, and just go, well, this is for 3 days. Absolutely brilliant. I walk across the car park, and I'm just, yeah. The doors of the conference centre slide open in front of me. There, about 10 paces ahead, the desk full of all the lanyards and badges for everybody. Bit like this morning's, only about 5 times bigger. Really big conference, really going to be good. I take 3 paces into the room, and then it feels like I've been hit. I'm hit by what feels like a tidal wave of noise and swept away. Suddenly I'm doubting myself. I'm doubting reality, and to be honest, I don't even know what way up is. I'm asking myself, do I really want to go through with this? I'm asking myself, can I do this? Would it be better to just turn around and go? I didn't. I did take the other 7 steps forward, collected my badge, and went into the auditorium for the first session. The first speaker, I have to say, was absolutely awesome. A bit like Chantel this morning. And I just sat there and I was mesmerised. The MC then caught me on the hop completely at the end of the session because I was brought back to reality when she said, and now there's a 15-minute break. And suddenly the room erupts into noise because all that noise was only everyone just chatting to each other. It wasn't any more than that. But it's okay, it's only 15 minutes. 5 minutes, well, that will be going to the toilet. I can hide there. Couple of minutes, no more detail, Chantel, don't worry. Couple of minutes, stand by the coffee machine, get coffee, perhaps a couple of bits of inane chat. Get back into the auditorium 5 minutes early, back into that comfortable chair where nobody's going to be talking and it's peaceful and it's quiet again. Brilliant, I can get through that. I've got to be honest, the second session was not as good as the first. Maybe it wasn't the speaker, though. Maybe it's because of 2 things. One is, I'm now aware that after this session comes lunch. And the apprehension I can feel welling up to the point where I'm not really listening fully and engaging with the speaker. And the other is that the speaker's done some of those things that says, put your hands up and do this, jump up and do this, which really hasn't helped me either. So we have lunch. Lunch that time, and all you have to do is go and chat to 250 other subject experts, confidently talk about what you do, engage with them so that you can have some kind of social connection. I think it's called networking. I call it hell. Compare that with my favourite pastime. This is where I'd rather spend my time. Underwater. The only noise I can hear is bubbles, my bubbles. I'm there with some very, very close friends. And if you imagine it for a second, you can just hear yourself thinking. And when you get really relaxed, you start to see things that are hiding in front of you, absolutely in plain sight. And you don't see them unless you stop and relax and notice them. For I am, you might have guessed it, guys, an introvert. Not only that, I'm proud to be an introvert. Here's the point. Lots of introverts haven't either realised what it means, or they're still struggling with dealing with it, and somewhere between a third and a half of your audiences and your networks and your connections are also introverts. So what I'd like to do today is share some of the ideas that have come from the research that I've been doing over the last number of months, where I've been talking to about 350 businesses, and some interesting things come out. 33% of the people I've surveyed say that they are not as productive or as engaged as they want to be or ought to be. Which is a bit scary when you think, hang on, if we could close that productivity gap, if we could get more engagement from them, what would it be like? So you are a speaker, perhaps you're a trainer, business owner, even a manager, maybe you've got staff as well. There's one thing that's in common with all of those things. You have to influence other people. And between a third and a half of the people that you have to influence are introverts. So if you can understand that more readily, if you can adapt your style to be able to influence them better and engage them better, what's that going to do for your speaking ability and your speaking business? It's going to help you. So what I want to do is share some ideas and explain to you some of the background behind some of that research. Of course, if you're an introvert in the room, I'm going to share some tips that have come up from the interviews that I've done. Some people have come up with some ideas that kind of struck me as a bit strange at first, and then I've asked other people and they've also gone, yeah, that works for me. So I'm going to share some ideas as we go. And what I want to do is split it into 3 sections. We're going to talk about what is an introvert. We're going to talk about the 5 myths of introversion, because there's some really silly ones around, and there's some sensible ones. And then probably most importantly for you guys, how will you improve your speaking business as a result of all of that? So let's start with the first one. What is an introvert? I'd like you to answer a question for me. Without putting up your hands, without shouting out the answer, I'd like you to score yourself on a scale of 1 to 5. Question number 1. There's 4 of them. Question number 1. Do you tend to over-prepare for conversations or meetings or events? Score yourself 1. At the other end of the spectrum, do you just like to wing it? Score yourself 5. Or anywhere in between. Question 2. Do you tend to talk in order to understand what's going on around you and talk to yourself or to other people? That will be a 5. Or do you tend to stop and think things through quietly for possibly quite a while in order to understand them? And that's a 1. And let me give you a story that goes with that. 15 years ago, I was the franchise development manager for a retail company. And I was for the north of the country, and my colleague Harry was the south of the country. My boundaries went from St Albans to Inverness, and so I got it wrong somewhere. But we'd had about 2 years at this, and it was going quite well. Franchisees, we had recruited some really great guys, some good coaching, and their results were stellar. The franchisor, my boss, was happy, and the franchisees were happy. And I shocked Harry one day as I walked into the office, sat down with him and said, Harry, I'm leaving. And we talked about that for a couple of minutes, a little bit about what and why. And then Harry shocked me. In fact, I was dumbfounded by Harry's next reaction. He spent an hour and a half to 2 hours on the phone to key people in his network, telling them what's just been going on, and essentially asking them what he should do. And I was completely dumbfounded because that was so far from what I would do. I would have gone home, I would have thought about it, and maybe gone back the next day and asked Harry 1 or 2 more questions. So if you're like me and think about it a lot first, you think in order to talk, score yourself a 1. If you're a bit like Harry and you talk in order to think, maybe you'll put yourself as a 5. Question 3. Are you a private kind of person? Score 1. Or do you let it all hang out there? Score 5. And question 4, last question for you. If you're in a room or a group of a large number of people, perhaps a bit like today, Do you find that energizing? Do you find that's, yeah, great, score yourself 5? Or, a bit like me, do you find your batteryometer, good word that one, draining almost by the minute as the conversations go on, such you're just finding it really, really tiring? You can get through it, but it's really draining. And that's a 1. So introverts, by definition, are inwardly thinking and inward focused, so they think inside their heads rather than talk outside. Introverts will, definitionally again, tend to be those people that lose energy when they're in a large group of people. The larger the group and the less they know those people, the faster the energy drain. Extroverts typically will be energized by being with that large group of people. Introverts typically are good listeners. They value privacy and humility. Introverts typically will want to, it's called process their thoughts internally as a process externally. In other words, as I said, do you talk to think or do you think to talk? And those are kind of all typical things that introverts will do and react. And the other kind of one that follows on from that is they tend to be good at detail, where typically extroverts would do much more big picture stuff. So it's kind of a few bits of definition around what is an introvert. At which point you might ask yourself, so what? You might say to yourself, is any of this real? And you might start asking yourself about myths about introverts. Now, a couple of you are looking at that slide a little confused. So I'm going to say this is my humour, so just do excuse me. It was originally a genuine typo, okay? Originally. I then left it up there and thought, oh, that's fine. It's about as daft, and this is why I left it up there, it's about as daft as some of the things I have heard. Here's a classic one that you guys might get, because you've seen me standing on this stage for the last year and a half. It's rumoured that I kind of like bright orange. I have been told by several people, John, you cannot be an introvert because you like bright colours. Really? So let's think about it a bit more seriously, shall we? And let's correct the spelling mistake, because it annoys some people in the audience. Angie's kind of going, oh. Myth number 1, introverts are shy. Absolute rubbish. Introverts has got nothing to do with being shy whatsoever. Shy is, if you like, a fear of social engagement and a fear of talking to people. And there's a spectrum where you might be a little bit shy, right up to the other end of it, which is much more akin to social anxiety. An introvert will be happy to engage in conversation, but bear in mind, again, this energy draining thing. So I can understand where the myth might come from. Because I know that if I'm going to engage in a conversation which is going to drain my energy, I might choose not to engage in that conversation or not to engage in as many. So I can see why people might go, yeah, introverts are shy. You don't want to talk to them. They're shy people. Myth number 2. Introverts are not good leaders. Really? I've heard this again and again. Good leaders are extroverts. Extroverts are good leaders. I think this is complete bunkum, and I think it's a really sad reflection on today's society in the UK, particularly, or the Western society. Why? Because it seems that to be a good leader, you're expected to be bold and loud, sound confident, and probably be quite mendacious. You can look that one up. I'm not going to make any political comments, though. And so, is that really what a leader does? I don't think so. Let's think about leadership for a second. Something about a vision for where the business is going, the drive to achieve the vision, to work with the team, to understand the team, and to inspire the team to move on. Where in any of that does it say you have to be an extrovert? None of it. So where does this myth come from? I don't know. But just to really ram the point home, you've heard of Microsoft? Relatively big and successful company. So it seems reasonable to say the guy that really got the company going and was the head of it for many years, Bill Gates, must be a successful leader. Introvert. Facebook. We can say what we like about Facebook. successful, doing really well. The person in charge of it, Mark Zuckerberg, when he's not stealing your data and giving it to Analytica or whoever, raving introvert. And the third one, I asked 103 people, because I like this asking questions thing. I asked 103 people in the UK who they think the best example of a good leader is. 63 of them came up with exactly the same answer, and I think that's pretty good going. And this particular guy, he's well known for being kind of affable on camera, chatty, runs a good company, slightly quirky. He's done lots of incredibly successful things. Richard Branson, raving introvert. So do you have to be an introvert to be a good leader? Absolutely not. Next myth. Introverts are antisocial. Bunkum. You can have all of them there. Introverts are antisocial. In fact, it's little sister, and they're condescending and superior and aloof. Really? Again, I can understand where some of it comes from. A bit like this. If I know that my energy will drain when I'm going to be socialising, I might cut that short, or I might choose not to socialise. And that's the same for many of the introverts I've asked. How might that get interpreted? Antisocial. But condescending and aloof, and yet this is something that people regularly say about introverts. About 15 years ago, I started my coaching business. And anyone ever been to those breakfast networking groups, where you eat a lot and you mingle with about 40 other business owners, chat to them, socialise in the hope that you're going to get some business? Well, I did that for about 5 years. The good news was it worked. The good news was that some of the people I met then are still clients now. Over that 5-year period, I met, hundreds of people. I got to know, to the point where I could remember, probably 10, 20 people. I became reasonably good friends with, one or two. About 6 months ago, I met up with Michelle. Michelle was one of the one or two. And we did what old friends do when they get together. Glass of red wine and a bit of reminiscing. Do you remember the good old days? And we were chatting away, and she said to me, John, you do realise that when I used to go to that group, I would be defending you, because people would say to me, John's really aloof and he's standoffish a bit, isn't he? And she would actually say to me, no. And she said to them, I defended you because I would sit there and say, he's one of the most people-focused people around, he's incredibly helpful, and he's probably the least judgmental person you'll ever meet. And then we talked about this for a few minutes again, to start going, where does it come from? Because this is a common myth amongst about introverts. And again, it comes back to this. If I'm in a group of people and we're chatting away like out there and I'm starting to feel a bit de-energised, what might I do? Might step back a bit. How might that get interpreted? If I'm in a discussion with 3 or 4 people and they're all rabbit, doing their nice loud bits and pieces, and I don't have anything much to say, or I don't think it's going to add huge value, I don't. And yet when I sit there and go, right, now there's a really important point to make, and I've got some detail and data to back it up, what will I do? I'll say it. How might that get interpreted? He always thinks he's right. So I can kind of see where it comes from. It doesn't make it true, but I do genuinely see where it comes from. Myth number 4, you're an introvert or you're an extrovert. Nah. Think back to the questions even that I just gave you 4 questions earlier. And in those 4 questions, you might have answered yourself 1 for something, 3 for something, and 5 for something. You might have been in the middle. There is a spectrum of this stuff. And so when I talk about the people that I've surveyed 350 business owners generally. And I'd split it for ease now into thirds, where a third is kind of at one end, thirds at the other, and a third's kind of in the middle-ish. But again, you've got extremes there. And the last one, which always makes me smile because I've heard it time and time again, good speakers are extroverts, and if you're an introvert, you can't be a good speaker. So I'm not going to claim that I'm a good speaker. However, I do know some absolutely brilliant speakers who come up on this stage and they are introverts. Maybe it's because that's that kind of jacket of vulnerability that we put on when we stand on stage. I don't know, but maybe that's what allows us to do it. Maybe that explains why there's many actors and comedians who are also introverts. No idea. So my real question is any of this real? So we're going to talk about drugs in a minute. It's all right, Mindy. Don't get too excited. You see Mindy's face there? She's like, yeah, drugs. The first point I'm going to raise is it has been researched for many, many years. And the first psychologist to get commonly credited for the explanation of this was Jung, which is about 100 years ago. And he talked about it quite a lot. Since then, many psychologists have looked into it, and increasing amounts of research have been done on it more recently. And now we will talk drugs. One of the avenues of research has been on neuroscience and neurotransmitters, drugs inside our body, and we all have them. And it turns out that introverts are more sensitive to dopamine than extroverts. So what does that actually mean? Dopamine, the happiness drug, as it sometimes gets called. Dopamine, the one that rushes around you when you're stimulated and you're excited. So if you're more sensitive to that, that might explain why I would go out for dinner perhaps for an evening with a group of people and be really happy to be socialising, but after a while, I'm kind of wilting a bit. Whereas somebody else you know that's in the audience today who quite often designs programmes and things will just be starting to rev up at the point in time where I'm wanting to escape. Much more extroverted than I am, much less sensitive to dopamine. So it's just a little bit of explanation that might fit around that. So is it real? Yeah, I think I'd say it's real. I mentioned earlier that I think that the problem is made worse because in the Western business world, success is designed around and measured in terms of extrovert. Let me give you a few examples of that. We mentioned the leadership one, and that's quite common. People believe, you guys are really educated, but lots of people believe that good leaders are the loud ones, the ones that are kind of up on stage doing strange things. And so that's society measuring success in terms of extroverts. Networking. We talked about networking earlier. It's a way which all of us get business, or many of us got business. What was that number you gave us earlier, Chantal? A third of your marketing is networking? A third of your business?
Yeah, a third.
And that's not uncommon, because I watched everyone going, yeah, earlier this morning. So networking is really important, and yet ask around, and what do I hear quite frequently? And I'm going to paraphrase Charlie Lawson, who I interviewed on this subject. So, Celia, don't tell him that. Is Celia still here? Don't tell him that I said these exact words, because it's my paraphrasing of his words. Size doesn't matter, it's what you do with it. But the success thing is always, you hear people, I've got a great big network, or so-and-so's got a really big network. So what? But this success keeps getting measured in extrovert terms. Let's think about meetings, training sessions, where typically the manager or the boss might walk in and say, right, okay, guys, here's the problem, and stick some stuff up on a slide. What are the answers then? Shout out the answers. And what gets happened? The introverts are processing internally. They're thinking about an answer. They're working through some detail. Those people who don't like the detail and who talk to think are shouting out their answer. They haven't even thought it through, because that is how, I don't mean that nastily, but that's how they think. Some people think by talking. And so what do we have? We encourage that because, oh yeah, great. A couple of days ago, a friend of mine, Karen, was chatting to me. She had been told off by her boss. She had been in a meeting for the day, and she was accused of being completely disinterested and disengaged in this meeting because she hadn't added anything to the meeting. She had heard lots of other people adding stuff, and she didn't have anything extra to add. So what did she do? Silence. In fact, it went on a bit worse than that, because she was then accused of kind of being deliberately awkward in that meeting. Why? Because she didn't say anything. And yet the same boss a couple of months before had said to me that she doesn't say a lot in meetings, but when she says it, it's incredibly valuable. So it's a bit strange the way we measure the impact in meetings. But this idea of shout out the answer is really measuring success and helping successful extroverts rather than introverts. And how does that work on stage? Shout out the answer. Shout out your questions. I'll just leave that one with you for a second as a question. And my favourite one of all, who designed the open plan office? What is that all about as a way of distracting people? So, if you are an introvert, how do you get over some of these things? So these are some of the results and some of the ideas that came from people that I spoke to. Number one, stop. Stop worrying about it. Stop trying to be an extrovert. Stop trying to be something you're not. It's incredibly draining. Focus instead on your strengths. What are the strengths of an introvert? Well, I've mentioned a few as we've gone on. What I'd like you to do is think about an introvert you know. I'd like you to grab one of these cards, or two if you can find two, that are kind of around most of your chairs. And I'd like you to write one word to represent the strength of an introvert, or one strength of an introvert, on one of those words. And I've got a number of helpers around the room. Who, when you put your word on that card, are going to collect them. So, one strength of an introvert. What do you think the biggest strength of an introvert is? One word if you can. I'll allow you two, but I want it in nice big letters because I've got to read it. So, if you've come up with your word and you've started to hand those to my helpers, somebody's going to take them away and summarise them for me. Isn't that good? So, tip number one, if you're an introvert, focus on your strengths. Tip number two, think about time. Earlier on, I told you about an arrival I'd had at a conference a few years ago. Absolutely true story. It was, however, my first PSA national conference. It was called Mega back in those days. Great 3 days, absolutely shattering. And guess what stupid John did the next day? He's out with a client. He was about as useless as a chocolate fireguard. Mentally fuzzy, absolutely no good. What do people tend to do if they thought about this? Book yourself a day off after a big social gathering like that. Really simple one. You might not always be able to do it. So what could you do that helps again? So back at my third Inspire conference, I learned the trick of do not go to every single one of the sessions. So I skipped one. The next year I skipped two. I learnt more. I was better energised afterwards. Last year I think I only went to 2 of the sessions. So that was pretty good as well. So think about time. Give yourself the gift of time. If you're an introvert, think about orienting yourself and your skills around those important people around you. That's a posh way of saying, come out the closet. Let me tell you about Ben. Not the Ben that's in this room. Don't worry, Ben. Ben is an introvert, and he'd get home from spending a day with people and he'd be absolutely exhausted mentally. He'd want to sit down quietly at home and then he'd start thinking through some of the issues that cropped up. His wife would come home like an ant on speed, running around the room wanting to chat and talk about what was going on as her way of processing what was going on. Kind of a bit of tension was going on. When I talked to them about the introvert and the extrovert and they understood, they went, well, actually, you're not being bloody minded then. You genuinely are. And they negotiated their own ways around it. What about your network? Do they understand the way you work? Do you understand the way they work? How do you orient yourself around that? How do you adapt your strengths to fit the people you're with? And the final one, if you're an introvert and you're coming to meetings like this, get a position. Anthony, would it be fair to say you've got lots of roles that people could help with?
Absolutely.
Now, here's the thing about having a role in a meeting like this. It makes it far easier to get into conversations with people. Much, much easier. And therefore it becomes an easier day. If you then go, I can't get a role because I'm only going to one particular meeting. invent a role for yourself. Goes like this. What's your expertise? What could you learn from the people in the room? Hello, Fred. My name's John, and I'm doing a survey on introverts. Do you mind offering me some help for a couple of minutes? Nobody genuinely says no to offering a bit of help. Would you mind answering 3 questions or 2 questions? That's your survey done. That's a role. The really good thing about having a role is you get into conversations easily. Then there's that thing that happens. It's going somewhere really good. Or you want to back out of the conversation. Because you've got a role, it's really easy to back out because you can just say, I've got to go on now and survey all the other people. So introverts think about stop. How, however, do you get the most from all of the other people around you? How do you get the most from others? Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. Let's think about some of the issues that I've mentioned earlier and then go, here's some solutions. Now, when I do this keynote normally, it's to leaders because it's about helping them close the productivity gap within their firm. But most of the solutions don't require a lot of tailoring to help us as speakers. So let's think of a few of them. And I'll tell you a very quick story which will highlight 1 or 2 of them. I used to work with somebody, and a number of years ago, and he would ring me up every single week, and he'd go, John, great to speak to you. I'm just ringing you up because I haven't spoken to you for ages. How are you doing? Oh, I'm doing really well, thank you. Note the holding statement there. That's a little trick, because actually what I'm doing is processing the answer. So I've just got a holding statement. I'm doing really well, thank you. Take a breath. Well, that's really great because in the last week I've signed up 15 new clients. I've done this. I met the MP for so-and-so. I've done... To the extent where I was absolutely convinced, because he carried on for 5 minutes, that he had a little hole inserted in the bottom of his lungs so that air could come in there and he didn't have to breathe. But the point was he'd get to the end of that and say, anyway, enough about me. How about you? Well, I've had a really good week and... Oh, fantastic! And then he'd repeat the whole thing again. Until he got to the end and he'd say, I've got to go now. What do we learn from that other than he had a big ego? One of the things we learn is when dealing with introverts, give them space to answer, give them time. So if you think somebody's in, just give them a little bit more time. If that's a one-to-one conversation, if that's a client conversation, how much of your speaker business is about what you do on stage and how much is what you do with clients and getting the business in the first place? Give them time to answer. Give them that bit of space. Because if you jump in, they're closing down. When it comes to giving people space, you can do that when you're running meetings as well. One of the things that people often talk about is, you know the old training technique of using Post-it notes? Where you get everyone in the room to write stuff on Post-it notes. Okay, we can debate whether it's a good training technique for many things. However, one thing it absolutely does do is it allows introverts to process and think in exactly the same way as the extroverts in the room. What do you get as a result? You get a much richer, more diverse answer that's really going to encompass all of the best thinking that there is in that group. And then you put the things up on the wall, or they do, you get them to rearrange them, and you've got the introverts engaged. By the time they're engaged, they will start talking more. It's not that introverts don't talk, but you need to engage them differently. And then let's think about that one from a speaker's perspective as well. Because how many times do we do the get up on stage and shout the answers out, and what's the answer to this, and what are you doing to the introverts in the room? You're closing them down. Or you get them to stand up and dance. What are you doing to the introverts in the room? So I'm absolutely convinced that some people love it. But is your job to get all of the audience influenced and engaged? Or just the people that love dancing and shouting and whatever? One really simple technique comes back to the same thing again. And I did it a few minutes ago. I asked you to write down what are the strengths of an introvert. I have to put my glasses on for this. Because you told me. You said to me, the strengths of introverts, they are thoughtful, and these are the top 5, analytical, listening, mindful, and focused. But you did that without any shouting out. And more if you got engaged. So here's my final thought when I talk about you and your business and what can you do with introverts. Think about your strengths as a business owner and your weaknesses. Think about the strengths of those that work with you, and if they're introverted and they've got those strengths, how could you be using those strengths in your business? So my final thought on what as a speaker, just remember that when you're on stage, getting the audience to do activity is a proxy for engagement. It doesn't mean they are engaged. Engagement is what we do with the brain. So I said earlier that introverts typically hide in plain sight. And sometimes it's kind of difficult to spot them. So some of the really obvious ones, which if you're standing in a group like that and you see the person that always stands at the back of the room, they may well be an introvert. Just because they're at the back of the room doesn't mean that they are. If they are on their phone, their smartphone, looking at their emails, chances are, 95% of the time, they're not. They're actually just wanting somebody to talk to. Now think about this as a speaker. You know how many speakers go out and engage people in the room beforehand? Because when they get on stage, there's already some key influences in the room. You've seen that technique happen before? Well, rather than going and talking to the ones that are loudest out in the room, how about going and talking to the introverts out there? Because if you've already got them engaged, when you get into the room, how much richer an answer are you going to get? Because your job is to influence the room, and the more of them you can influence, the better. So how about picking out some of those introverts? So are they on the phone? Are they pretending? How about people that in conversations with one-on-one or 2 or 3 people are much more lively than conversations with a lot of people? What do you think is going on there? Probably, not definitely, quite probably introverted. And I could go on for a long list of things that introverts look like, but they are very good at hiding. So just look for those little signs of what an introvert is or isn't. Because I want to kind of wrap up and just leave you to think about a couple of things. Whether you're thinking about an audience, whether you're thinking about a team at work where you've got a workshop of people that you've got to get motivated, whether you just think about teams generally, the biggest thing a benefit for a team is the mix of views that are out there. There's that mixture and diversity of views. You know, companies are paying thousands of pounds out to have diversity programs. And okay, they are, again, using physical diversity as a proxy for what they really want, which is different thinking. And yet, those same companies quite often are ignoring and mistreating by ignoring or pushing out the way a third of their audience. So what can you be doing to change that whether you're facilitating workshops, training sessions, or you're up on stage? Because in a world where change is ever faster, in a world where there might not even be enough talent, isn't it crazy that we're dismissing a third of the talent around us? You guys can engage the other 33%. You're in a fantastic position to do that. And I implore you to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Now, before John disappears, as you all know, I want
me awkward questions.
I want to ask you really awkward questions now, if that's okay.
Bye.
Now you've got everybody G'd up. I want to put you under the magnifying glass. So I mentioned earlier on about how my business is split up and my 30%, 50%, 20%. Just wondered if you could elaborate a bit on how you actually make your money.
Sure. So most of my income comes through coaching. I also work with a business school and developing business students. The speaking part of it is something that I'm refocusing on now. I've changed it from the speaking I used to do a couple of years ago, because I now work with a completely different audience of people. I was focused on accountants, and over the last year I've been refocusing it and changing that. So my intention is to come back to growing the speaking part again this year.
Awesome, fantastic. Well, I'm curious to know how you plan to do that. But how did you start working with the school? You weren't expecting me to ask that, were you?
School?
You mentioned working with the school, didn't you? Just then? Or business?
Oh, the business school, yeah. Because I had studied with them, I knew, again, it's that network thing. I wouldn't have called the couple of people I knew part of my network.
Okay.
However, we were talking and they said, actually, could you help us here?
Awesome.
So
So
I did.
you worked your network.
Absolutely.
So my final question, and I will open it up very quickly to a couple of people in the audience. How do you plan to focus on the speaking then for this year?
Okay, so number one is give myself more time. I can do that because you've taken all the time from me, thank you. Number two is working with a mastermind group to develop myself. Number three is focusing, and Chantel touched on it this morning, marketing. And number four is working with a damn good speaker coach.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to throw it open now. We've got a couple we'll take
Okay,
before we go
cool.
to the last speaker.
John, fascinating. I was told a few years ago that I might be an ambivert.
Okay, that's something in the middle.
Is it something in the middle?
That's
Because
something
I
in the
almost
middle.
feel like I'm bipolar, that sometimes I'm very introvert, but other times that I kind of put my cloak of extrovertism
So if you
on.
remember the 4 questions I gave you earlier, you might have forgotten, but I could ask you about 8. What you might find is that for some of those, each of those is definitional of introvert, but you might find for some of them you are introverted. In other words, you're more at the extrovert. That explains why on average you're in the middle, but there might be some things which trigger more one reaction than another.
Interesting.
But
Fantastic.
quite often it's about coming back to the energy thing as the real kind of definition thing.
Awesome. And we'll take, we've just got to take 2 very quick questions
Okay.
from this side. And then we'll
John, you've really given me pause for thought. I run workshops from the perspective of a BBC journalist where I create a newsroom, masses going on, exciting, adrenaline to get productivity going. You've given me pause for thought about how off-putting that must be for a third of the audience. Can you give me one tip in the room, one tip for just getting them on board and not assuming they're all going to be extroverts?
So I think the first thing is know your audience. You might be working with, I don't know many journalists. They might be all extroverted in the first place. So think about your audience. If it's a normal mix. So the next thing I would think about was give this time processing thing. Give them what you can before they meet up. Some people won't read it, of course they won't. But ones that know that they're interested in the subject and they want to do well or learn will read it beforehand. You've now given them the chance to process that material. You're going to get much more engagement from them and talking about them as well. So that's one quick one.
Fantastic.
John?
One final question.
First of all, great talk, thanks. One point, suggestion for another leader who's an introvert, the Queen. We don't really know what she's thinking, but she's a great leader.
That's a really good point, yeah.
The second point is to do with the question you got from there, which is that, I'm a boring psychologist, personality traits, personality is seen either as a trait or a state. So you can sometimes be an introvert and other times not be an introvert. So I think the same person, depending on how they're feeling today, can either be, let's go for the party, or hide in the corner. So I think taking that into consideration, so rather than always labeling people as, oh, that person's always the introvert, or that person will be the life and the soul, it's useful for people to think about the fact that we can change ourselves, and so not to label people and assume that those people are always not going to say something.
I mean, my view on that, absolutely. What is the value of the label? 0. However, what it does, and this is why some people say to me, why do you focus on introverts, not all personality traits and this analysis and that? Because it's one thing that's relatively simple to understand, and by understanding it, you can start to change things which make a big difference to performance. That's why I focus on just the introvert part. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's like the shy. Shy is a behaviour. Introvert is something which is inside us. So we can change the way we respond to people. We can get over the shyness. But we won't change that, the sensitivity to dopamine, as an example. Nothing I can do will change that. So I'm always going to react in that way.
That's awesome. That's really fascinating. And I thought I sat in the middle, but there were certain questions that you asked where I felt that I was actually leaning more to one side than the other. So please give it up. Thank you ever so much, John. And a little thank you from us.